Good evening. Rather, a good evening, a good afternoon, a good morning, wherever you are around the world. Welcome to Opportunity Desk. My name is Binja Zihalira, and I'll be hosting or moderating this incredible show. So, today we're going to talk to Christian, an incredible researcher and a teacher. He's actually a Swedish American teacher who is going to tell us more about how the youth, or rather, how youth organizations can accelerate and adopt to a post COVID 19 world. It's going to be a very interesting show because I'm, for one, keen and I'm going to be excited. I can already feel the excitement, because as an organization, we're always looking for ways to accelerate. And since COVID 19 started, a lot of people have seen retrenchments happening, a lot of people getting worried if they're going to get fired or how the organizations are going to survive a new world that we're going to have to come in and adapt to. So, Christian is here live with us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, you name it, we're there. Good evening, Christian.
Good evening. It's really nice to be here. I'm really excited about this.
Awesome. So can you please tell our viewers a bit introduction about yourself, your background, so that they don't talk to a stranger?
Yeah, so as you mentioned earlier, I'm a Swedish American. I was born in the United States, grew up a little bit in both countries. Currently, I've been working as a teacher in Falköping, Sweden, which is a rural area of Sweden, about halfway between Gothenburg and Stockholm. I've been teaching young people there. And it's been a really interesting and engaging opportunity to allow me to deepen my skills and my knowledge while also exposing me to some unique challenges and opportunities here. Previously, I studied at the University of Michigan, where I obtained a bachelor's degree in economics and international studies. And while at Michigan, I became involved with European Horizons, a kind of a transatlantic youth organization, which really kicked off my engagement in youth affairs and provided the foundation by which I'm speaking today. And so I'm really excited about this opportunity. In the fall, I'm going to be studying at Columbia University, and I hope to apply some of these skills, which I'm going to talk about here today, there as well. And I hope to inspire and enlighten you to some of the opportunities and possibilities available.
Awesome. That is actually very incredible. Whoa, your background, eh? You are what we call a multi or a diverse personnel. 1 minute you are Swedish and then the next you American and then hey, who knew that Europe has even got rural areas? Hey, Africans, now we know you as well, hey? This is amazing. This is really amazing. So, before we dig in and deep into the questions, how a person's going to survive a post-COVID world, can you maybe elaborate more about maybe how organizations are suffering right now, right? Because we know that when COVID started, we thought it would only last a few months. But now, as researchers are going, they're telling us that this could maybe even last, well, the effects could even last up to 100 years. So, maybe you could tell us as before we talk about post COVID, can you maybe tell us challenges that businesses may encounter? Because sometimes you may even have a problem, but you don't know how to name it. And you don't know how to name your problem, you can't sort of overcome it. So, can you please maybe elaborate more on that?
Exactly. And so I would like to say there's about three main challenges with youth organizations face today. And before I get into that, I want to say one thing. We're facing an enormous amount of challenges in the world today, a lot of uncertainties. We have the public health crisis, we have an economic crisis, we have a crisis of racism and social disparities, we have economic inequalities, and of course the climate crisis, just to name a few. And all this uncertainty, I know myself, and I'm sure that a lot of people feel it. It can be stressful, it can be anxiety inducing. How do we adapt to this? How do we go forward? But while there is so much uncertainty in the world today, I think what is certain, the only thing that really is certain, is that young people can play a role in shaping the world of tomorrow. And so I hope today to inspire some of that action. So to delve a little bit deeper now into what the challenges are, I think there's three main challenges. First of all, there's a challenge of engagement. And I think you can look at this in two different ways. First of all, we have a challenge of engaging with our members. So that's the people who are a part of our organization. Let's take European Horizons, like I was a part of before, as an example. European Horizons has chapters at various universities across Europe, the United States, and Asia. And it's really difficult for them now to engage with those members in the traditional way, which is through having meetings and conferences and other events. And so youth organizations have to think, how can we adapt to this? and how can we think about how do we engage with our members in a new way. And I'm going to talk about some of those solutions later on. The second part of this engagement problem is what I like to think about as a problem of engaging with our audience. And I don't mean audience in necessarily the same way you think about media or TV and so forth, but thinking about the people that you're working towards. So maybe you're working on improving food insecurity in your local region. Maybe you're working on improving women's rights in your region, or you're working on improving minority rights. Whatever it may be, the challenge of how to reach out to these people, how to have that traditional path of engagement is quite significant right now because we can't have in-person events. So that's the second major challenge. Then there's the challenge of funding. And I think as anyone who's been involved with the youth organization has felt before and will feel in the future, is that funding is a major challenge for young people. And especially right now, because of the economic downturn, we have this crisis of the economic situation. And because of this, companies, think tanks, foundations, they're going to be less willing to provide funds to young people and to youth organizations. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on how you can improve your profile to be able to be a little bit more attractive to firms and to foundations to win some grants and some other forms of sponsorship. But this is a challenge. It's also a challenge because young people are, through youth organizations, you usually have events like conferences and seminars and workshops, which serve as ways of earning funds. So maybe you have a participation fee. Maybe you have people buy one of your, maybe it's like a flyer or something along those lines. And because you're not having in-person events, either you can't have these types of products or you can't charge as much for them as you have before. So this challenges the funding model for a lot of youth organizations. Lastly, I would like to talk about a third challenge, which I think is a little bit more nuanced. And I think this one is a little bit less clear, but I think if you think about it, it's very important. I like to call this a challenge of centralization. And what I mean by this is that all around the world today, we've seen governments, institutions, regional organizations have, for a variety of reasons, sometimes because it's been necessary, sometimes because they've used it sort of as like a little bit of a power grab. They have reduced what I like to think of as the decision-making sphere. And this is the group of people who are able to influence a decision in the private sector, in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector. And so because of this, because the decision-making sphere has lessened, this means that there's less room for youth to have a voice. And so I think these are the three main challenges: a challenge of engagement, a challenge of funding, and a challenge of centralization, as I like to call it. And I'm going to dive into some of the solutions to this in a moment. I don't know, Binjo, are you there? While we're on this, since we're seeing before Binja comes back, oh, there we go, perfect.
Awesome. Right here. I was just thinking of all these challenges, centralization. That's a new one. That is a new one. Who knew that an organization can actually, make the decision whether the youth can be part of an influence? I mean, take a look at the hashtag Black Lives Matter. If you look at the forefronters in it, it's usually a lot of youth. I mean, who knew that some organization could actually come and say, you know what? They would actually put a bridge on that. I mean, as a youth, especially the millennials, we always thought we are we're the commanders of this era. We can make all these decisions, but that's a new challenge. That's a very new challenge. I'm actually, yeah. If you guys don't know about it, and before I forget, if you have any questions for Christian here, please write them down and save them for later, because that's when he's going to answer them. But before you write your questions down, I like doing this thing where I wait if the host or the guest is going to answer it before I even ask it. So yeah, just keep an open ear, start taking notes, and centralization. So Christian, now that you've given us all these problems, remember, like I said, it's really amazing how a person can first have to look at a problem, because part of problem solving is to identify problems. And while we're identifying these problems, can we now dig deep into these problems, these challenges, and maybe later on how we can solve them?
Yeah, perfect. So if we go back a little bit on each of these points here, I'm going to start to tie in some of these solutions now. So I'm going to begin to tie in some of the solutions while touching on the problems a little bit more. If we go back to engagement, for instance, in Sweden, I know, and I know this is true basically across the world, at-risk populations are especially right now vulnerable, at-risk populations for the coronavirus pandemic. And so these groups of people, they are right now having to isolate to an even further degree than what other people, young people in general, for social distancing purposes, for instance, in the lockdowns that many countries still have, are forced to do. And this means that the traditional means of engagement, let's just say you're, for instance, working on providing food to elderly people or elderly care to elderly people. I know there's a lot of youth-based organizations which work on that. If you're doing that, your complete method of engaging with these people has been changed, because it is often the case, I think it's true across the entire world, it's fair to say, that elderly people are less capable internet users. They have less access to internet. They might have other health risks or situations which make it more difficult for them to meet with people. And so because of this, it becomes really difficult for youth organizations to engage with them. And I think that's one example of that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the solutions in a moment. But before that, I want to provide an example, which I used when I first thought about this topic. I thought about this specific organization. So 3 years ago, I met Taika Onash, who's one of the founders of DeedMob. DeedMob, if you're not aware, is a Dutch social startup. And what they're doing is they're connecting young people, and really people of all aspects of society, but especially young people, who want to volunteer with organizations, companies, services, and people who need and want volunteers. And so they're connecting people who want to provide something with people who need something. And this developed into a very successful platform. They developed a lot of expertise in this topic. And then what happened, the coronavirus pandemic comes, and they're thinking, how can we make a difference? And what they realized was they could use their expertise, they could adapt it to the coronavirus problems, and then they could thrive within that. And so what they did was they created a platform called coronahelpers.nl for the Netherlands. And what they were doing then was they were connecting people who wanted to help in the coronavirus pandemic. So especially young people who are less at risk than especially elderly people. They connected those people on their platform with people who needed assistance, who couldn't go and buy groceries or medical supplies or maybe walk their dog or what have you, because of maybe they had the virus, or they were very at risk, or they lived with someone who was at risk, and so they didn't want to expose them. And so they took their old platform, they adapted it to the current situation, and then they developed a thriving platform as a result of that. And I think that's the perfect example that every youth organization should strive for. And so now as we begin to think about how do we resolve some of these challenges that I mentioned earlier, the challenge of engagement, the challenge of funding, and the challenge of centralization, I think we can break it down into 3 big picture things. And then I'm going to, within each of these, I'm going to talk about some more specific solutions as well. So to begin, you need to change your mindset and be innovative. And what I mean by this is thinking about the example that I just laid out. They had a platform, it was working fine, but then they saw another problem and they thought, we can resolve this. And so within your organization, maybe you're, for instance, working on combating food insecurity in your region, or you're working on prison reform, or you're working on migrant rights, or you're one of the many great organizations that are existing right now, which are working on improving social cohesion and reducing racism. You can then think, okay, how can I adapt my organization? How can I use our expertise to then apply this to the current situation? And so a mindset change and a change of and thinking innovatively, I think this is a really important first step before you do anything else. Let me provide another example. 2 years ago, I attended the South American Business Forum, which is a business-based organization based in Argentina, which engages young people from around the world on issues of business, social change, economics, politics, and technology. And they usually do this through a major conference every summer in Buenos Aires. This year, because of the pandemic, they were not able to host that. And they were thinking then, how can we keep our members engaged? Again, thinking about engagement, as I mentioned before, keep making ourselves relevant and important in the decision-making process, thinking about centralization and also funding. And so they decided that they were going to have a lot of online events. And I participated in one a few weeks ago, which was a debate. And it was really well done because they broke people down into small groups. And this is a really good piece of advice, I think, for other people here to think about. They broke people down into small groups. And then they asked people to debate a question or a topic. And this created some really fruitful thinking and thinking big picture and innovatively and creatively. This is a good way to think about how can we adapt to a new challenge. They did so by creating a new form of digital engagement. And I think you should think about that too for your organization. So we have innovation and mindset change as the first big solution that I propose. The second thing now is outreach. And as many of you, as I mentioned before, many organizations have events of different kinds. Maybe you have training events, maybe you have conferences, maybe you have seminars, maybe you're going out to your local community for religious services or food banking or providing healthcare or whatever it may be. And this process has been disrupted. And so I think there's a couple of key things that you want to keep in mind here. First of all, you want to make sure that your platform and your work is as accessible as possible. And what I mean by this is that as many people can have access to it as possible. So one example, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this later on, but let's just say you send out a mailer. So you send something in the post to people. You can then include a QR code to your website, which all organizations should have, a QR code to your website, and then let's just say it's to a report that you want people to take a look at. If they then scan that QR code, they can, like that, come to the website and to the report, whereas otherwise they would have to maybe go on, search on Google for your website, click a few links, and then get there. You want to reduce the amount of steps that people have to take. There's a lot of information going on right now. People have a lot of distractions, especially if they're at home. So you want to reduce the amount of steps that people have to take, and you want to increase the accessibility. Going back to what I mentioned a few moments ago about elderly people at risk. As I said then, a lot of those people don't have access to good internet. And if they do, maybe they're not really good internet users. They're not going to be able to do as we do, go on Facebook and read about the latest news. And say you're a youth organization which works with elderly people, providing elderly care of some kind or whatever it may be, you have to then think the opposite of what I've been getting at so far. So most youth organizations right now are thinking, how can we engage digitally? What you want to do is you want to think the opposite. How can we engage with these people in a traditional manner? So what I mean is maybe you're sending out a brochure debunking coronavirus myths. Maybe you are sending out a brochure about hand washing. Maybe you are sending out some type of newsletter or a report. Maybe you're sending out, elderly people, they're isolated, they're maybe a little bored. Maybe you want to send out, this is just an example, a crossword with something that ties back to the mission of your organization. And so that's a really good way to keep engaged. You also want to make sure, going back to the digital environment now, that everything you do is mobile friendly. Most people, myself very much included, I check almost everything on my phone. Most people do the same, or on their iPad, and if not, on their computer. You want to make sure that your website, that your social media profiles, I'll talk about that more in a second, but that your website is mobile friendly. So it's easy to read, the images are good. Again, you want to reduce the amount of friction, you want to increase the accessibility of your platform. And this means that the things that you're trying to achieve, the values you're working towards, maybe it's the sustainability goals, that they're going to be more effective, that your work's going to be more effective there. You also want to think about how can you have an impact, a little bit bigger picture on outreach. And so what I mean by this now is we're living through a time of enormous disruption. And disruption has a couple of different impacts. For one, disruption means that the traditional power hierarchies, so the traditional decision makers, it's not a guarantee that they're going to be able to remain in power. And this is true, of course, in politics. It's true in economics. It's true in business, in social environments. I think the current Black Lives Matter protests around the world are a terrific example of this. And so what you can then think about, how can we empower people within our organization to not only do all the things I've mentioned so far, and that I will continue to mention as we continue this talk, but also to think about maybe engaging in politics or creating a branch of their organization which focuses on a specific area, those types of things. So these are some of the steps that you can do in terms of outreach. And I think the key thing here is really reducing the barriers to access. Lastly, and this is going to take up the majority of the remainder of this talk here now, is going to be talking about what I like to think about as organizational things. And I'm going to call it organizational things, not a fancy name like centralization before, because there's a lot that is encompassed here. I want to begin by talking about publications and by making basically the voice of your organization. So as I mentioned before, we have a crisis of centralization right now, which means that the amount of decision makers, for instance, in politics and economics and business, has been shrunk. It's people who are at the height of policy, maybe it's the president or the prime minister. They're not necessarily reaching out to as many people as they debate important policies right now. So you want to make sure that your organization, your youth-based organization, is having as big of a voice as it can. And this point that I'm outlining right now, I think is very important for organizations, but is equally important for individuals. So if you are trying to build a profile for applying to university or graduate school or your first job, or you're thinking about starting your own organization, everything I'm going to outline now is important then as well. So publications, what do I mean by that? Let's go back to website. As I mentioned before, every organization should have a website. There, you can make a free one. It's important to have one because that gives all the information about your organization and your values on it. On this website, you want to have a blog. And on that blog, you want to be writing, maybe it's weekly, maybe it's bi-weekly, so every other week, maybe it's once per month, about different topics related to your goal. So let's just say you're a new youth networking organization. So you connect youth who want to apply to jobs. I know there's a lot of organizations that do that. I've seen many through Opportunity Desk, which have been terrific at that. So maybe then every week you're writing an article that describes different tips and advice about CVs, cover letters, other ways to engage in the job hunting process. Again, you want to increase your voice. Another example, let's just say you are working on improving water sustainability. So you're trying to improve the quality of water in your region. One thing you can do then is you can work on a bigger report. So not a weekly blog post, but a bigger report. And this can have the impact of, number one, describing the challenge, maybe the water challenge that you face in your community. It can outline some of the solutions. Is it that you need more money? Is it that you need new technology? Is it that you need policy change? Is it a combination of all of that? Probably, and maybe it is. So you want to then have these bigger reports which can help reinforce your message. And this is a great opportunity, especially for youth-based organizations who are no longer able to do in-person events because of social distancing and the pandemic, and who now must need to do so digitally. Another advice, tying right in with this, is going back to engagement. So one of the challenges is you want to engage with your members. That is tough to do because people have a lot of distractions. People maybe feel disconnected because they're not meeting with the people in person. Maybe you have a contest on social media where people submit blog posts and then the top 3 blog posts get published on the blog and the best one gets extra recognition on social media. This is great because it keeps members engaged. It keeps content coming on your website so you seem relevant and up to date. And it helps to reinforce your voice, your message. That's really, really important. Sidetracking slightly, I'm going to get back to publications here in a moment, but sidetracking slightly. So let's think again about funding. So there's a smaller funding environment. There's less money available right now. How are you going to stick out? You want to make sure that, number one, your organization conveys its message as good as possible. You want to make sure that, number two, it is doing so frequently and in an up-to-date manner. And you want to have statistics. You need data to show this is how many visitors we have on our website. This is how many people are interested in our product, in our report. So if you do these types of things, blog posts, reports, and so forth, you can then have this data and this engagement, which is terrific for when you're trying to apply to funding. So that's a really good tip that I encourage all youth organizations and individuals as well to keep in mind. Continuing a little bit now on this note, the European Youth Forum, which is a Europe-based youth organization which works to basically engage young people in the European policymaking process, recently released a report called Blueprint to Recovery. And this was basically a pretty detailed report on how how they envisioned the European recovery from COVID-19 to be. Every region, be it a small town, fall shipping in Sweden like I've been working right now, or a much bigger region, each region has unique challenges and requires unique solutions. And even if you're only working on a small subset of this, maybe you're working on education in your local town, you have the expertise from how education works in that town that you can then build a report, a blueprint in that instance, which can provide the foundation for the post-COVID-19 future of your region there. So these are some of the good pieces of advice there. Some other small things that I also want to mention, other things that you can utilize. Number one, a really good thing to keep in mind is podcasts and also videos, like what we're doing right now. I think this is a terrific way to engage people, because it gets tiring to read the same thing all the time, to read over and over again. And so you want to engage your members, and you want to engage your audience, your local community, the people you're trying to reach out to in different ways. And the podcast, maybe once per month, where you bring in experts on sustainability or climate or whatever it may be that you're really focusing on, that you bring in experts and they talk about this on your podcast. This is also a great way to showcase, again, going back to funding, to showcase to companies that, hey, we are a prestigious organization that brings in important people to talk. And that means it gives more data points and it gives more influence and so forth. Another piece of advice, in 2017, so 3 years ago, I attended a political conference in Latvia. And this was a really interesting conference because they had trainers, people who were educated in training others. And of all the conferences that I've attended, this was the one that I learned the most from. And so one thing I encourage people to do, and this is especially true if you are an international organization. So you will have maybe you are based in South Africa, but you have members across the world: North America, South America, Asia, Europe, Oceania, the rest of Africa. What you can then do is you can have different types of online training sessions where you're training your members to go and advocate in their local communities. So as an example, some countries are in different stages of the coronavirus pandemic. And so some countries have very strict social distancing where you can't meet with anyone except really digitally. And some countries have much looser restrictions, if any at all. And so what that means is that even if you're based in one country which has really strict restrictions, your members might not. And so you want to think about, okay, we can't do anything here, but how can we train our members to advocate for our goal in their local community? I think that is really important to think about. Some other things, just to kind of, some other pieces of advice that I encourage people to take into account. And this again sort of ties back into the organizational aspect of it. It is difficult to keep people engaged and to keep people organized, especially when you're spread across the world in different time zones, even if you're just in different cities in the same country. I know this myself from personal experience. It is difficult. And so if you're feeling the same, don't feel disheartened. It is very common, not only for young people, but really for people of any walk of life. It is difficult to stay engaged digitally. So you want to, again, as I mentioned before, reducing the barriers. And you can also think about this in terms of how your organization is structured. So You want to make sure that everything is well organized. Maybe it's on Google Drive and Dropbox, the two services that I recommend the most for organizing things. You can make sure that everyone has clear tasks. They have a clear calendar of when certain things are due. They have a clear kind of folders of this is where my work is. And by doing all of this preparation, it'll make the tasks that you need to do later much more effective. And as a result of that, by making the tasks more effective, that means that the work, the goals, and the values that you're working towards will be easier to achieve. So that's one piece of advice. The other thing, and I think it's great, we said when we were going to have this session today that we're aiming for about half an hour of talking and then about 45 minutes in total when you throw in questions. It's proven that if you have very long sessions digitally, it is difficult to stay focused. If you're learning, if your university courses have been moved online, I think you will definitely feel this. That is much more difficult to stay engaged digitally. And so let's just say you've had meetings and seminars before, which you've now decided to move online. Think maybe about reducing the time span of those so it's easier for your members to stay engaged and for your audience to stay engaged. And if you don't want to reduce the overall time of it, maybe have a break of half an hour, a break of maybe like 10 minutes in between. And this is a great way to keep people engaged. So, youth organizations face three major challenges today, in my opinion. A challenge of engagement, a challenge of funding, and a challenge of centralization. And there are a couple really concrete and I think really important ways to help resolve this. You want to think big and you want to think innovatively. Just as I mentioned earlier with my example about DeedMob, taking your expertise at the moment, and everyone is an expert at something. Even if you just started to do something, you are an expert at that thing, and you want to make sure that you utilize your comparative advantage. If you've studied economics, you know what I'm referring to. Your comparative advantage in that subject or in that field to help improve and work towards the values that you're trying to achieve. So you want to think big. You want to think about outreach. You want to think about how can we have the best digital outreach to the people who we can no longer meet in person, and how can we have the best physical outreach. So I'm not talking about contact, but I'm talking about brochures, newspapers, newsletters that you print out and send to people who maybe don't have internet access or who maybe have internet access but are not internet savvy. And lastly, you want to think about how can we improve as an organization by improving our internal working, shorter meetings, clearer structure, and especially by improving your voice, right? How you engage and how you demonstrate to the outside world the work that you do. I want to finish on the following. This is a great opportunity for youth organizations to innovate. Let's say you're an organization and you've done three things so far. You do three types of things. You have one major conference per year. You have two basically workshops per year, smaller events, and then you have a publication. This is an opportunity for you to test all those things digitally. And what this may show is that at the end, so after you do all these things digitally, and then you come back and you can do them again, you have the option to do them again in person. What you then might want to do is you want to compare and see, okay, was it more effective to do this digitally or online? Maybe you find out, okay, the conference, it was about the same. It was about the same efficiency doing it in person and online. And if we do it online, we save costs, which helps to combat the funding issue. That's good. If you do the workshops, maybe you find out then, oh, this is actually an area where it was more efficient to do it in person, where you had that close engagement. And then the reports you might find, this was definitely better to do online. It saved cost in printing. It made it easier to coordinate and to promote. So that was much better to do online. And so you've taken this crisis that we're living in, this challenge, and you've thought innovatively, and you've applied it to your organization, to whatever you do, and now you've come out more efficient at the end of it. So I want to go back to the quote that I began with earlier. In a world of uncertainty, the only thing that is certain is that you can shape the world of tomorrow. And I think that is what I really want you to take away from this. Thank you. So we have many questions, which I'm excited to answer.
Yeah, definitely. Man, that I just got educated once again Thanks to Opportunity Desk. And I love how you mentioned that this is actually a great time to be online because the more you think about it, a lot of youth organizations, in fact, a lot of organizations per se, always look for ways to, get funding and things like that. But right now, we are actually engaging, and not just us but also a lot of people. We don't even need chairs. I'm sitting at the comfort of my home, you're sitting at the comfort of your home, and the viewers as well. So this saves us a lot of money, a lot of cost, and just the heebie jeebies that go around with this whole planning thing physically. And I loved how you mentioned that this is a sort of a time to evaluate yourself as a business as well, to see if you are actually compatible, because life after post COVID-19 is going to be a bit different. Every single time a pandemic, you know, comes around, there's always something that changes. Whenever life gives us pressure, we make diamonds. Well, we choose to make diamonds. So, now we're going to be taking your questions. So, remember in the beginning of the session, I did ask for you to note down what questions you have. So, now we're going to have a question for Christian to answer. Christian, are you ready for the questions?
Yes.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, let's do I think we should definitely begin with the first question. So what do you think about it?
Uh, is it, sorry? Is it the in all of the challenges of the? Well, I'm not seeing there.
Oh,
There is
there
that
we
the
go. There
question?
we go.
Yeah. Sorry, I
Okay.
was a bit confused.
It's okay. It's okay. COVID-19.
Yeah. Yeah.
I blame it on COVID-19.
Yeah.
So Joseph Detti says, how can we engage with these people in traditional rather methods for who we are, rather who aren't digital? I think it's going back to where you were talking about the brochure people is what I call them. So maybe you can dig deep into that for him. Maybe he didn't quite understand it better.
Yeah, so this is actually a really important point. I have two grandparents living in Sweden here right now, and they can't go and meet anyone. They don't know how to use the internet. They have access to it, but they don't know how to use it. And they need a lot of services in terms of healthcare, in terms of kind of what I like to call kind of stimulation intellectually, because it's tough to sit alone inside your home all the time. And so, how do we engage with these people? So, there's a couple different ways. Like I mentioned during my talk before, like you mentioned, the brochure people, you can send out physical things, so physical mailings. You can send out something fun like a crossword or a Sudoku or anything, something like that to keep people engaged. Where you then also mention, say you have like a crossword up here, you can then talk about your organization and your work to combat gender discrimination or racial discrimination. And this is a great way to get people interested and to educate them. So that is one way. The second way is you need to think, and this is going to be different depending on where you are in the world. It's not going to be the same everywhere, because it's going to depend on the legal restrictions of the pandemic. But if you have a little bit of a looser restriction, so you are able to host small events but with social distancing, you have to wear a mask, you have to social distance, but you're able to host an event, then you want to think creatively. Maybe you have back in the day in the United States in the 1950s, I know that they had drive-in movie theaters. So you went and watched a movie in your car. Maybe, I don't know, you have a drive-in bingo, and you talk about, just as an example right here, you have a drive-in bingo, and before the bingo and then after the bingo, you talk about your organization's work to fight racism and to improve economic equality. And that's a great way to keep people engaged. It's a great way to think about, think out of the box. I mean, think really out of the box about how do we reach out to people in a non-traditional manner. And so I think those are some of the great ways to do it. And lastly, I would just also add, many people who maybe don't have access to the internet maybe have access to TV. If you are a more prominent youth organization, you can think about how do we get a spot on a news show, and we can talk about some of our things there. That's a way to also reach out. Same on radio as well.
Oh yeah, definitely. One thing I know about radio, especially community radio stations, is that they're always looking for organizations that are helping and reaching out to people. So maybe if you're also an organization out there, especially a young one, communicate with the community radio stations, even your major TV. I mean, you never really know until you know, right? I mean, what do you have to do? Is it's an email, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but like my my second question, rather, for you, Christian, on behalf of my people, because before we started this whole interview, I sort of went on and asked, what would they like to ask you? Some people are even social media side. So yeah, one of my people asked me is for certain organizations, as I mentioned earlier, that we are still unfortunately going through the pandemic, and how can an organization maybe avoid retrenchment? Because now we're seeing that only essential workers are considered a priority, and not forgetting that every character in an organization actually plays a part. So how do you think an organization could actually maybe skip the retrenchment part and maybe keep because every salary matters at this moment. So how can maybe an organization reduce retrenchment, especially youth organization?
Yeah, so if you are a youth organization or a youth business which employs people, I think it's really important that, like you said, you don't want to lay people off. You don't want people to lose their jobs because that hurts them a lot. It hurts the people who are dependent on them, and it also hurts your organization because you're losing their talent. And so in those situations, you want to think about a couple of different things. And it's tough, to be clear, it is tough. Number one, you want to reduce any unnecessary costs, both in the short term and in the long term. So if you're planning an event, maybe it's a digital event, but you have to still somehow, maybe you have to pay for someone to speak, or you have to pay for a certain type of equipment. Evaluate if you need to do that. That's the first thing. The second thing is that you really want to reach out to, number one, kind of your local municipality and region, and maybe even government, depending on the types of assistance provided. I know some governments around the world have provided assistance because as a result of the pandemic, but not all. And so this is really something which is not going to be, unfortunately, it's not going to be possible for everyone to do. But you also want to reach out to all of your contacts. And so one of the things that I saw a few months ago that was really interesting was actually not a youth organization, but I think this can be applied here. It was actually a restaurant which I really like. And what they were doing, they realized there's no way we're going to be able to afford to stay in business. And so what they did was they said, if you give us a certain amount of money right now, a small amount of money, you will then in the future receive double this back as a gift voucher for our food. And as an organization, you can think about that as well. So let's just take the following as an example. Let's say you're an organization that has a conference every year, which many organizations do, and you have a participation fee. What you can then do instead is you can say, if you pay the participation fee now, maybe half the participation fee, you will then receive, not only will you not have to pay that participation fee for the conference in the future, you will also then receive some type of special recognition for helping to support your organization at the moment. And so by doing that, you are asking for money because you need it, but you're also then providing these people with something in the future, and you're making people feel good and engaged. And so I think that's a really good idea in that sense. And then lastly, I think, one thing that I've come to learn, and I think this is something you come to learn over time, is that never hesitate to reach out to people. Never hesitate to ask. The worst you can get is a no. So really think about, what are all the people we've worked with over the years? What are all the contacts we have, all the organizations we have? Let's reach out to people and think, how can we, is there any way that we can receive some additional assistance? And this is a great way to try to stay afloat in a very challenging time.
All right. So before I ask, that was actually really informative. Yeah, definitely. The more you think, the more you do. And like I said, you are absolutely right. The worst thing you can get is a no. That's it. That's actually it. But before I ask one of my last questions, we have a question from Rather Comfort Onyaga, who says, how do we address challenges with organizations that address livelihoods of the poorest rather households and communities that don't have access to internet, and what rather technologies can they leverage amid COVID-19? And I think this is a very important question, because remember how I said I was quite surprised that even Europe has got rural areas. And I know that especially in organizations, it's difficult, because you might say, I want to have a digital conference, but they don't have internet, they don't even have cell phones.
Yeah.
They just basically, struggling for food. So how do you maybe tackle or tackle these kind of situations?
So exactly, great point there. That as you said, even in Europe, even in very wealthy countries, you still have areas which are very poor. I've been teaching at a rural school here in Sweden, and many people in that area are well below the national average income. And that means that they face challenges which people in many of the bigger cities do not face at all. And this is, I know, is way more pronounced in many developing countries. And so, as I spoke about before, there are some ways that you can do this through what I like to think about the traditional means of outreach. So through sending things to people's homes, and we kind of talked about that before, so I don't want to reiterate that too much. If people have access to radios and telephones, then you can engage through things like WhatsApp. Maybe you can have a WhatsApp newsletter is one idea which I've seen people use. You can have, if you can get onto a local radio show for 5 minutes every week and talk about the work that your organization is doing. Maybe, for instance, your organization is a healthcare provider for underprivileged women in your community. You can then try to negotiate with the local radio provider and say, can I get on this radio broadcast 5 minutes per week or 10 minutes per week and to talk about what my organization does and our values? So those are some of those types of ways. Now, unfortunately, many people don't even have access to a phone or a radio or TV or some of these other traditional methods. And then it becomes really difficult because in the current environment where we have to maybe socially distance. And so then you want to think about, can you do things outside of people's homes? And so what I'm thinking here, and this is again, if you have a complete lockdown where you can't leave, then it becomes difficult. And if you have an organization that is spread across a large area, it also becomes more difficult. But one of the examples that I've loved as a result of kind of innovating during COVID is teachers in the United States. They've been driving around to people's homes, standing, a long way away from their homes, many, many meters, and holding up signs of encouragement and so forth. Maybe you could do something similar. Maybe you can take your car or your bike or your motorcycle or your moped, and you can go around to some of those key communities at a distance, if it's allowed legally, and maybe try to have some type of event and provide information at distance. Those are some of the ways you can think and do. But to be fair, it is a big challenge right now, given the constraints of the coronavirus, and also given the many lockdowns that are in place in many countries.
Yeah, definitely. Like my second last question for you, Christian. So Oshira Fun. I don't know if I pronounced the name properly. Like it's a global thing, eh? But she or he is asking, how can we make sure that team members are on the same page since we are all working remotely? And for me, I feel like this is one of those key questions
Yeah.
because yes, it's beautiful to work online. It's amazing. But right now, what if I'm thirsty and we're having a conference call right now? I need to go drink water, or I get disturbed. I have a kid somewhere. How do we as an organization make sure that we are all on the same page? Because remember, I said coronavirus is providing us a time to sort of reflect, and a lot of people are reflecting on leaving certain organizations. So how do you sort of make sure that we are on the same page as an organization?
It's a terrific question, and it's a challenge which I myself very much agree with. I personally enjoy working person to person a lot more. I think it's a lot easier to focus. I think it's a lot more effective. I wish we could do that right now, but we can't. So what are the things we can do? So I mentioned a little bit of this earlier when I talked about my solutions. I think the key thing is a couple things. Number one, you want to make sure that all the work that your organization does is as organized as possible. To take an example from Gordon Ramsay, my favorite chef, he says that the more preparation you put in, the better the food becomes. And I think that's a great parallel that you can apply to your work as a youth organization. The more preparation you put in to organizing your organization, if you will, the better your work will be in the future. So I recommend using Google Drive, because then you can really organize everything in one place. You can have everyone attached to the same calendars, which you can then connect to Google Meet and Google Hangouts, which is the video calling systems on Google. You can connect that to Google Gmail, so everyone has an email account, and to Google Drive, which is a place where you can organize documents, spreadsheets, especially, which is important in many organizations for keeping track of things, and presentations. And this is a really good service that is free, and if you're not using it already, and if you're not using anything similar, there's things like Microsoft Teams and Microsoft Outlook, but I really recommend this one. So I recommend that, and taking the time to put the work in to prepare and to organize, it is worth it. Dropbox is another great service where you can send files to each other. Let's just say you're doing kind of a youth researching type of thing where you're working with young people and doing research projects. You might have really big files of data or papers which you need to send around, and then you can upload them to Dropbox, send them to another person, and then they can open it from there. And you don't need a special email account to do. It's very simple. Some of the other tasks, other services which I've used, and these are digital services to be clear, so it becomes more difficult if you don't have access to good internet, to be very clear about that. One is Notion, which is a note-taking app, which I've been utilizing for the past few months. It's really good because you can divide things into pages, you can add team members, you can assign team members. That is a really good way to, again, keep things organized. Let's just say you're part of an organization which works to further intra-regional trade in your region, and you're working on a paper. One section of it is working on a paper. You can then assign the team members of that paper a page in Notion or a folder in Google Drive where all the work for that project is there. And then you, as the supervisor, then have to make sure that they're meeting the deadlines, right? And that makes people accountable. And I think that's the most important thing here, is to keep people accountable. If people are accountable, then it'll be a lot easier to function. Lastly, I will say, I would avoid using things like Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp for doing this type of organizational things. They're great for communicating about smaller things, but for doing this really big organizational stuff, use some of these softwares for this, and then keep the more personal, more kind of fun stuff to things like Facebook Messenger and WhatsApp and WeChat and so forth. I think that's a little bit of advice that I have from my personal experiences.
Awesome. So our almost very last question is from Sonia Tesfaye, who says, how can we, as the public, support youth organizations as volunteers in person, or providing rather monetary aid when it comes to these kind of pandemics? Sonia, love your question, because I love it when the public actually tries to help youth organizations instead of, always the other way around.
Sonia's question is terrific, and it shows that many youth organizations, they think, well, would people really want to help us? Would people really want to donate money to us? If you don't ask, you'll never know. And Sonia just showed that here was someone who wanted to engage and who wanted to help and provide. So first of all, as a youth organization, take the advice we mentioned earlier and do have those types of things. Do have a request for funds. Do make sure people can join your organization. Going back to her question now, I think the most important thing is on the flip side as well. If you reach out to a youth organization and say, hey, I'm really interested in the work you do, I want to help in some way. I don't know exactly what that might be. Maybe I can write a report. Maybe I can work on social media. Maybe I can do some type of promotional work in my community. Reach out, and then you can see what possibilities there are. They might answer, they might not. Depends on the organization. Lastly, and I think this is also important, is keep in mind for youth organizations, keep in mind that you're working towards a goal. So, for instance, European Horizons, which I was a part of before, they were working towards European integration and transatlantic solidarity, so cooperation between North America and Europe. Even though you want your organization to be successful, and that is important, it's also important that you're working towards your goals. And so if you're an individual and you feel like this organization, they're not responding to me, I've sent them an email, what you can do then is you can think, well, how can I do something as an individual to work towards this goal? Can I write something? Can I start my own organization? Can I reach out to other people and see if they're interested? So you also want to keep that in mind as well, that you're ultimately working towards a goal. And even if you have to take a little bit of a different path to get there, it's important that you still reach the destination.
Wow, this is incredible. This is incredible. I was smiling because I wanted to ask you the last question is as an organization, I've always wondered, say let's say I have an incredible idea, I've had this for a long time, been sleeping on it, and bam, here came coronavirus. Is this a good time for a person or a group of people to start an organization?
This might sound a bit weird, but I think this is the best time. And here's why. Right now, we have huge disruption. Everything is changing. And what that means is there's a ton of opportunity to shape the world of tomorrow. Now, right now, we have this funding challenge, we have engagement challenge, we have the centralization challenge. But if you're starting something new, if you're starting a new organization, you don't have any members yet, to be frank, you don't have any funding yet. So
Hmm.
there's nothing to lose, right? Everything is just building from there up. And so I think that's the first thing to keep in mind. I think this is a really good opportunity to do it. I also think this is a time that needs youth engagement. This is a time that needs youth engagement. We see Black Lives Matter. They're engaging people across the world. This is a perfect time to get involved. You see other organizations doing similar things. You see a ton of people needing help with medical services. Unfortunately, we see even in very wealthy countries a big food shortage at the moment. So there's a lot of need at the moment, and I think that means this is a great time to start an organization, and it also means that if you're not constrained by some of the challenges which face established organizations.
Definitely, definitely. But before we finish, because I look at the time and I'm like, oh man, but listen, dear viewers, dear amazing viewers, you can always tweet us your what you thought about the session, your I would rather say your review. This is the time where you get to see if Christian was really being. I mean, like I said, I for myself, I've been learning throughout this wonderful session. But we would also like to hear from our viewers. The comment area. What do you guys think of today's session? And if you have any reviews or any comments or any insights, you can always tweet them, or you can also always write them on Facebook, which is, I think, one of the incredible things. And again, Christian, I'm silent because I'm having, that when something happens and you have like 60 seconds of silence just to thank the person for the great job they've done. Thank you so much for your research, for your insight, for answering all I had like a lot of questions. Honestly speaking, I had a lot of questions for you, but Mister, you cracked them all during the process, and that's one of the things that I really appreciate about you. And one of the things is, oh yeah, see, here we go. People are saying, especially in specific comfort, says, thank you very much for the response, Christian. The session is very insightful and it's helping us think more out of the box right now, which is exactly what we need because we've been in this box, right, for a very long time. You need to host an event, call people, be physical. It was always a physical world until coronavirus came and it changed our mindset. It's like, you guys, enough. Enough with this. Let's get on to the future. And Ada or Movish says, hey guys, you are doing a great job. So to everybody that has participated, Christian, once again, to people that have been taking the time, to the team behind the scenes, this is not just the two of us. It's not just me and Christian. There's a whole team behind the scene making sure that questions are answered. Christian's got a wonderful connection. I have a good connection. So we just want to thank you guys, man, and especially Christian once again. I really appreciate people that take time to help people out. I'm one of those. I'm one of those. Information matters, Information matters. So thank you very much. And yeah, and where can people find you, Christian? If say they
So
wanna.
you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Neubacher C, at Neubacher C. So I have my last name and then C. And then I also just want to say thank you so much to Opportunity Desk and especially to you for having this great moderation for this session. These types of things are exactly what youth and youth organizations need right now. And so keep up the great work. It's really making a difference.
Oh my word. Thank you so much, Christian. Yes, Oni B2 is actually right. this session is recorded, which means that if you missed the session where Christian spoke a little fast or I spoke a little too slow, you can always re-download this. Okay, there's a download button, and like I said, you can find it on Twitter, on YouTube, on Facebook, and all our social media handles where you can actually rewatch the session again. I know that a few organizations actually contacted me and said they're going to be watching. So if you maybe feel like you missed a few parts, or maybe some of your team members had other mindsets, like we mentioned earlier during the show, you can always rewatch this whenever you can, because this information will never get old, because you're gonna have to watch this video. In fact, especially after COVID-19, because this is when you're gonna have to start your action plan. It's gonna be like, oh wait, Christian said what? Oh yeah, rebrand. Okay, okay, kind of thing. So you're gonna need this most post COVID-19. This is just to keep you in the loop, to make sure that you know what's coming for you. But once you get there, I'm pretty sure Opportunity Desk, once again, we're gonna have more information to keep you updated and have more people like Christian to give you a lot more information. Seriously, I mean, he's like a dictionary right here for like information. Thank you, Christian. Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
yeah,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us live on Opportunity Desk. This is a platform that allows the youth, the elderly, and the young to engage and get information about life and opportunities out there, because everywhere and every day there is always an opportunity. Thank you so much. Christian, any last words?
Just thank you so much. Keep up the great work and keep trying to make the world a better place.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.